Last time in this short series, we looked at the idea of the inspiration of the scriptures of the Bible. And today I'd like to think about the Pentateuch and in particular then the start of Genesis. Now within the Christian tradition, the first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch. It's a word that comes from the Greek for 5 scrolls. And in the Jewish tradition, they're called the Torah. This is frequently translated as law, but really it's more accurately translated as teaching. The law translation comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which we call the Septuagint. It's been given this title because the 613 commandments of the Jewish law, which include the 10 commandments, are found within that part of the Bible. And a very rough estimate that I did myself indicates that about 48% of these books contains different laws, but we'll come to those at another time. Most biblical scholars agree that the Pentateuch is made up of different sources that were put together by editors. And the most famous scholar associated with this is Julius Velhausen, who lived from 1844 until 1918. And he wrote a book about the Pentateuch in which he outlined his documentary hypothesis, as it is called. And traditionally, there are 4 different sources which are given different initials to identify them. Source J stands for Yahwist, because in German that would begin with a J, of course. The Yahwist refers to God by that name, the name which was revealed to Moses in Exodus 3, verse 14. And in those texts, God is presented in a more anthropomorphic manner. He has human characteristics. So he speaks directly to people. He seems to take a physical form. He walks. He makes noise when he does so. And most scholars seem to place those writings in about the 10th century BC in the southern kingdom of Judah. Source E stands for Elohist. Elohim is just the Hebrew word for God, and that's exactly what the author calls God. The Elohist was writing a bit later, maybe in about the 9th century BC in the northern kingdom of Israel. And he portrays God as being more distant, more transcendent. So he speaks with human beings through intermediaries, like angels, dreams, or burning bushes. There was then a later editor who put these 2 sources together, and sometimes he then puts the 2 names together. The next source is called P, or the priestly source, and that writer is concerned with liturgy, with genealogies, with ritual purity, food laws, and that sort of thing. It's generally thought that he wrote Leviticus and the second account of creation in Genesis 2, probably during or after the Babylonian exile, which was in the 6th century BC. And then the final source is given the letter D for Deuteronomist. It is broadly identified with the book of Deuteronomy, and that in turn is identified with the book of the law, which was found in the Jerusalem temple in the reign of Josiah, and we find that described in 2 Kings 22. Obviously, we'll look at that more when we get to Deuteronomy, assuming we ever get that far. Now, clearly, when we read these texts, we don't need to spend all our time, if any, trying to spot different sources. But awareness of them does help us to notice different styles, different names and so on in the text, and then to account for them. So let's think about Genesis and the first book of the Bible. Now, the beginning of a book, so the beginning of the Bible, is very important. If we think of any book we've ever read, and particularly the first in a series of books, we'll realize that. So think, for example, of the general prologue to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It tells us who the pilgrims are, and it gives a pen portrait of each one that we take with us when we read each person's tale. The prologue to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet tells us of fair Verona. We learn about Montagues and Capulets, star-crossed lovers, and so on. The first chapters of Harry Potter tell us about Privet Drive, about Harry Potter living under the stairs, about the Dursleys, Diagon Alley, Quidditch, and so on. And if we launch into any of these books or any series of books starting anywhere except the beginning, then of course we're going to miss out on quite a lot. And Genesis, of course, is no different. So it's the first book of the Bible, and that English title, Genesis, comes from the Greek, and it simply means beginning or origin. And the Hebrew name of that book is Bereshit, which means in the beginning. And that's exactly where it begins, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. Now we know that every word of Scripture is God-breathed and is important for preaching and for teaching and so on, as St. Paul put it. But the beginnings are really important, and much of our Christian anthropology and theology can be found in those first books, those first chapters of Genesis. But before we go there, we ought to consider just the structure of Genesis and just outline what we're going to find. Broadly speaking, we can divide Genesis into three sections. Genesis 1 to 11 are often called the Primeval History. So we have here the stories of the origins, the creation of the world, including mankind, the fall, the time when sin enters the world, the first jealousy and murder with, of course, Cain and Abel. We find the decline of humanity into immorality and then the flood that results. We find Noah and his ark, and then in chapter 11, the Tower of Babel, mankind's attempt to conquer the world, his attempt to ascend to the heights of the divine, and then the consequent division of the world into language groups. Then we come to Genesis 12 to 36, and we find the story of the Patriarchs. To a certain extent, this is where history in the more modern sense begins. We find people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just to name the most famous. We find those important covenants with Abraham, the promise of the land, the birth of Jacob's 12 sons and his daughter, Dinah. And then we come to the final section, Genesis 37 to 50. It's sometimes called a novella because it tells us the story of Joseph. That's the Joseph made famous by Thomas Mann, the German author, and perhaps even more so by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Bryce. You know, the one with the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, although it could just be a coat with long sleeves, but it doesn't have quite the same ring to it. And then Genesis, of course, is going to lead into Exodus and the story of the slavery of the Israelites. So that's just a very quick overview, which I hope will give some idea of where we're going. And if you're interested, then do subscribe to our channel here. Do follow us on social media, Downside Abbey. You'll find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I'll see you again next time.